Hello. So after Zekphos, we moved on to Vectis. For Vectis, we split the raid up into four groups, and we did the fight as you would on Heroic, where you just nuked the ad. There were four Omega Vectors going out at a time, so there was one for each group. And sometimes there were two Omega Vectors in one group, so one person would need to move to another group that didn't have it. And you kept doing this and balancing the lingering infection by having the person with the vector move out. So there was markers placed down for each group, and you'd move outside of the marker, and the person that had to pick it up next would also move with you to pick up the debuff. And there was this really nice weak aura that told you how many stacks the people in your group had and who was next to pick up the debuff. I think there was a second weak aura as well, where it showed a ring around your character. So it showed you the timing of, or the cast of the contagion when you had 6 or more stacks, because at 6 or more stacks there was after the contagion cast you would pulse 3 times, and each pulse would give everyone near you a stack of the infection. And during the liquefy phase there were 4 groups, so we split the room up into quarters, and each group was responsible for their respective area during the liquefy phase. Fetid was a simple fight. It was basically a big DPS race. And all of these, everything in this video was killed before the nerf. So, anyway. I'm not really sure what the proper way to do Fetid was, so I didn't look up any videos. But the way we did it, yeah, I mean, it probably was the normal way anyway. We had our tanks. Our tanks had their backs towards one of the protrusions in the room, and we had everyone spread 5 or 6 yards around the boss, so in a big semicircle. And we had to pull the boss, so the boss walks around the room, and we had to do a pull time every time, or we had to do it in a specific position, when the boss was in a specific position, otherwise they wouldn't be able to tank the boss on one of the protrusions. Anyway. And so there were 3 ads that spawned, and there was one group for each ad. So there were 4 groups. One group had tanks and healers, and the other groups were all DPS, for the most part. And the 3 groups with DPS, each went onto one ad. If your damage needed time to ramp up, then you were assigned the big ad, and the smaller 2 were dealt with by classes that had more burst and more mobility. And you also had to save your cooldowns for every single ad, so you would never pop cooldowns on the boss for the most part. And there were 3 ad phases, or there were 2 phases to the fight, but it repeated itself 4 times. But you ignore the 4th set of ads, because by that time the boss would hit Enrage or Berserk. And just in case you didn't have cooldowns for every single ad fight, because there was like a minute or a minute 30 for every single ad. So in case you didn't have CDs for every single one, you popped your CDs on the first ad, and then we hear it on the second, and then you used pre-pop on the third ad. And also, the reason for the spreading was the miasma. So it starts off as a small ring, and then after like 20 seconds, it instantly grows to like 15 or 20 yards. It spreads as well, so if other people walk into your circle, but it takes like a tick for it to spread. So if you walk out instantly, then you might not get the debuff. And the fight, like, it was really tight, especially having lots of melee on this fight. And it stacks as well. The miasma stacks, so the damage would increase like exponentially. I mean, you were pretty much dead if you had 3 stacks. So if you stood in someone's circle for too long. I think the major problem with this fight for us was finding which ad you was supposed to go to, because the spawns were all over the place. There were 6 locations. The big ad always spawns in either of the middle ones, but the small ones can spawn anywhere else basically. And you had to get there. You had to get to your ad as soon as it spawned, because the boss would just eat it too fast if you were too late to get there. And if a boss finished eating the ad, it was a wipe. So it's all about positioning and saving your cooldowns for the ads. Moving on to Zul. So in the beginning, we were cleaving like so hard. So we did this fight without any sub rogues, and we did this with 2 tanks as well. I think most people did it with 3 tanks and a bunch of sub rogues, but anyway. So on Mythic, there's a debuff called Blood Recall on every single ad, that is, and it makes them revive after a short period of time after you've killed them, unless they have this other debuff called Decaying Flesh, which jumps onto them and lasts like 10 seconds. And there's only 1 Decaying Flesh up at a time. And the fight is basically just managing this debuff, because if you dispel an ad with Decaying Flesh, it will jump onto another ad. So it also means there's RNG involved, because say you had 3 ads and you dispel the debuff, it might jump to the wrong ad. So some ads have priority and some don't, obviously. We had 1 mage basically do 90% of the callouts, and he was because he was managing the debuff. He would tell you when to nuke and what to nuke and get ready to nuke, kind of thing. So we heroed on Paul, and we just killed everything basically, prioritizing the debuff, the ad with the debuff. You need a weaker as well, so it makes the debuff more noticeable. Anyway. And then when the hexes spawned, we gripped one in, killed it off, and then we gripped the other one in, killed that off, and then the fight basically repeats itself, where you kill the ad with the Decaying Flesh, but you had to push the boss. If you did the boss the way we did it, with 2 tanks and no sub rogues, you had to push the boss into its second phase. And every time the hexes spawned, they'd be polymorphed or trapped. So we CC'd every single hexer after the first wave. And that's basically the fight. The tanks take a lot of damage. Like, I didn't notice this at first, but when we tried to re-clear this boss like 3 or 4 times, the tanks were taking so much damage because I heard them calling out for externals all the time, especially into the second phase. And I think I got cleaved a few times as well because that's what the crusher does. I think it one-shots you. Anyway, so Mythrax. 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 There was a lot of movement, and positioning was also a big deal. So it was like Fetid, but you had to react on the spot to mechanics, which could target any DPS or healer. Halfway through the progression of this boss, the orb mechanic got changed, so the orb wouldn't spawn on melee. So all the melee could stack in the center for increased healing, and there was more chance of the ad spawning in an easier position if we were all stacked for the entire fight. Or like Fetid, there were 2 phases. Oh, what was I going to say? Anyway, so all the melee stacked in the center where the ad was supposed to be based. So there was an ad that spawned. Hold on, I'm going to talk about that later. So they're ranged. So the orbs would only spawn on ranged. And we had a few problems with the range not spreading enough and spawning them in the wrong locations, which I'll get to later as well. Well, actually, I'll talk about it now. So we had on one side of the room, there were these 2 boulders, 2 rocks, and there was a mark on each of them, and you had to stand directly on the boulder. And we had to move to and from these 2 rocks because there was a beam. So in the second phase, there's a beam from the boss and a beam from the ad. And the boss beams the ad, and the ad chooses a player and beams them. So everyone had to stand on one rock and then bait the beam, and then just before the beam gets off, you go to the other rock, and you repeat until you go back to phase 1. Yeah. So and all these little ads, so the ones that cast Mind Flay, the reason for standing on these rocks is if you stood on top of the rocks, all the little ads would spawn on top of the rock, so you could kill them off really easily and really quickly. Otherwise, they'd spread all over the place, all over the raid room, and it'd just be a hassle to deal with. I'm pretty sure it's impossible if you don't do this, if you don't have the ads stack up in some way, shape, or form. And the ad I mentioned before, where the boss beams the ad and the ad beams us. On the first phase, this ad spawns like, I'm not sure what the timer is, but every time it spawns in the first phase, you have to kill it off because it's just another set of beams. And so every time the boss beams, the ad would also beam. And that's the same in the second phase. So you never deal with one beam on its own. you only ever deal with 2 beams at a time. And the ad doesn't go away until it reaches 50% HP. And the hitbox of this beam from the ad was deceptively big. Nearly 180 degrees if you was up close. So as a melee, you couldn't stand like perpendicular to where you think the beam was facing if you wanted to consistently avoid it. I think it did like half your HP maybe, and it gave you like 12 stacks. And you don't want to get stacks from the beam, so yep. And another thing was during the fight, it was pretty hard to see which way the ad was facing. I mean, you get used to it, but it looks like a squid with 2 orange bits on its head, and you have to pay attention to the ad and which way it's facing, obviously, because it's just going to keep casting. Every few seconds it'll do a cast. It'll do a beam cast. So phase 1 is the ad spawns every now and then, and you have to kill it. Dodge the beams, the orbs, the ruin. The ad spawns on a random non-tank player. So that's why everyone has to come to the middle and bait, because if it spawns on a ranged and that ranged player is all the way outside, then everyone else has to go over. So during the fight, for example, it would go like the orb spawned, and then everyone converges to the middle where the boss was being tanked, and then they spread again because I think there's another orb that comes, and then you nuke the ad. Phase 2 began with the boss transitions at 65%, and there's this big cast and does loads of damage. You see this on heroic. I mean, the boss goes towards the middle, but on mythic, you tank the boss in the middle to start with, and then the boss goes off into his own corner, and it stays there until it goes back to phase 1. And also in phase 2, when the ad, you can't kill the ad, so you can't stop the ad from casting another beam by killing it off. Yeah. And we haven't really done anything on Cahoon yet. We're still on the part where we're just dealing with the orbs. We actually had one of our players make a warlock ult for the fight, and we tried to get as many clothies into the mythic raid so that we could gear him up fast, because we only have 1 warlock and it's best to have 4, but we have to do it with 2. I guess one of the last things I'll say is I'm getting into PvP finally, and I just feel so squishy as unholy. Man, I just can't wait for 8.1, to be honest. All the changes that are coming in. While, I mean, I've seen what people have said about our class and how they're not really fixing the problems at the root, at the source. They're just like they're basically giving in 8.1. They're basically giving us more regeneration, but not mitigation in particular. Or they did give us a. Depends how you see it. Anyway, so in Legion, I did really enjoy PvP, even though I had no idea what I was doing. So, and I didn't use macros either, and I was really bad at interrupting because without macros, kicking someone so hard. So basically, in Legion, when I started PvP, I got stuck at like 1.6. 1.6 CR. And then, and I wasn't a fan of 2s either. So I only did 3s, basically. I mean, I did some 2s, but I preferred 3s. And then, in BFA, I started like using macros. What else was I doing? I used some PvP add-ons, and I think I got to 1.9. It's not bad for someone that doesn't know what they're doing. But I'll see what happens in 8.1. It should be better. I should easily be able to hit 2k, which is it's basically what I want. Don't think I'll go any higher. Well, I might go higher, but I'm just not aiming for higher because I've got so much stuff to do. And yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.